I would like a literature festival for writers of colour because I don't think I've ever seen one or participated at one, and I think that it would be an amazing thing to be a part of. I think there's something very powerful about having to negotiate different spaces, as I think many people of colour have to do. And so having that reflected on the page, having that reflected creatively, I think is an incredibly powerful thing, that we are not only creating our own lives as part of the diaspora, but also that we carry the experiences of our parents, and we have our own aspirations for our families and the lives that we are seeking to create. So I think there's always something very powerful when I read the writing of writers of colour, even if it isn't explicitly about that. I think it comes with that sensibility. I think there are real issues about who gets to be highbrow, who gets to be published, who gets to be in those positions of, I guess, authority in some way. I think that rigid mould in which writers can be published, that being about cultural, autobiographical aspects of their life, is, I think, reflected everywhere, and it's coming back to the systemic issue of what are people of colour allowed to be, how are they allowed to have positions and voices of authority. It's often, to put it crassly, talking about black stuff, talking about things that are relating to culture. How many writers of colour are talking about the economy, or talking about history within literature. I'm happy wanting to be proved wrong, but what I'm finding is that it's very much coming back to this idea of being pigeonholed and being allowed to be published and to talk about certain kinds of things, but that it feels quite niche in a way. Yeah, it's difficult because at the end of the day we have the right to speak about our lives, and a lot of that is to do with culture and heritage and finding a place, as part of the diaspora, negotiating those different identities. So it's not a surprise that those kinds of things would be spoken about and reflected within literature. But at the same time, we should have the freedom to write and talk about all kinds of issues. And I feel like once we try and do that, that's where the kind of reticence is. I think people are surprised that I talk about things that are political, and people find that unexpected in a way, and the question is, why is that? I'm quite happy to go with an open mind and just to be part of an event which is for and by people of colour, and in a way that's normalised. I think for me, being a part of that is the most appealing thing. But I also would like to connect with the other writers of colour and learn from their craft, learn from their experiences, as well as share the work that I've written and the themes that I'm inspired by. I'm very socially, politically driven, so I take a lot of my inspiration from that. But then I'm also looking at the things that are happening political, but in a personal context. So I'm thinking a lot about home and what that means in an ever politicised context. Who gets to belong and why, if we think about the rhetoric that's being used around migration, home, belonging, finding safety is increasingly feels contentious. And I'm interested in exploring that creatively and also creating an alternative narrative to the reductive kind of headlines that we're surrounded by. The festival will be a great opportunity to meet other writers coming from various backgrounds, and I think, if we think about migration, it's we are being shown and offered a very rigid view of a migrant and of migration. And actually, I think it's the role of the writers to refute that and refute the kind of very reductive stories that we're being surrounded by. And so, you know, it'd be great to connect with different writers who are working in and around this area. There is a massive problem with writers being pigeonholed and stereotyped, and that's why I think that this literary festival is really important, because there's something really normal about it, to be a part of an event where you're not the token and you're not having to talk about diversity, but you're actually just sharing your work in a normalised space with other writers of colour. And I think that's really powerful, that becomes normal, and you don't have to therefore represent your entire culture as you often have to, or feel that you're kind of made to, in a space that is predominantly white. Well, I'm just really interested and open, so I don't have any specific expectations, but you know, to meet other writers of colour, some of which I'm maybe familiar with and others not so much. You know, I hope it's the start of interesting conversations, potential collaborations, and reflections, and you know, prepared to bankrupt myself buying lots of books. And that's, you know, that's as far as I'm kind of expecting, really.